Today we have Professor Koichi Nakano, who is joining us from Tokyo, and our moderator is Professor Linus Hagström from Stockholm, and I'll just very briefly introduce the two of them. So Professor Nakano is one of Japan's best-known commentators on Japanese politics. He is Professor of Political Science at Sophia University, and he has spent quite a lot of time in both the UK and in the US, and he specializes in comparative politics of advanced industrial democracies with a focus on Japan and in political theory. And then Professor Linus Hagström is Professor of Political Science at the Swedish Defence University, and he too has an involvement with Japan. He's been a visiting professor at Waseda University, among others, over the last year. And he focuses on identity, power, and international security, East Asian international politics, and particularly Japanese security policy, but also, of course, things involving Sweden, unsurprisingly. So this is how the timeline is going to work, and Professor Nakano is going to give a presentation first, and then there'll be discussion between our two speakers, and then the audience are welcome to join us for the discussion too.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Nana, and thank you everybody at the Dio Foundation for giving me the opportunity. And I also like to extend my particular gratitude to Linus for agreeing to be the moderator or the discussant for this talk. It's a quite an unusual opportunity for me to give a presentation on the. Let me share the slides here. On the topic of security policy, as if I were a international relations expert, which I'm not, as Jason kindly introduced. But I feel that I need to do that in a way, given the current discussions and the political change that is ongoing. So let me move ahead with my slides without further ado. So the first question is, what is driving the change? The most standard, of course, thesis is the so-called Rise of China thesis, which, of course, discusses how China has prospered and also became to present security challenges. But, of course, this perspective is really Western-centric and otherizing China, and of course, quite oblivious of the fact that the West has risen and has invaded and colonized quite a lot of the surface of the earth and beyond over the past centuries. And of course, its legacies are still with us today. This thesis also, to me, has the problem of really projecting this idea that, so there is this China on the rise, therefore triggering international relations challenges, leading to policy proposals that are to be implemented in a rather rational format. And by othering the threat and also by othering the cause of the change, it, I think, quite often ends up being oblivious of the fact that we live in a very imperfect world, and China is not the only problem that liberal democracies face. In fact, the changes and the challenges are quite often domestic. And politics today, of course, Japan included, but also the United States, is anything but rational. And much the same can be said about Britain too. And this raises the question, of course, what about the white supremacist, liberal imperialist roots of international relations? A question that the professor of international relations at the University of Pennsylvania, Robert Vitalis, quite unusually for an IR scholar in the United States, pointed out. And I think we do need to revisit this kind of perspective at a time like this, when we see atavistic return to white supremacist politics and expansionist ideas, or attachment to hegemonic control of the world, that seem to stem very clearly from the original roots of what we consider to be liberal democracies. I can go on longer on this point, but I'll move on unless there are other questions later on. There's also been it's also been pointed out, among others, John Dugard, who represented South Africa at the International Court of Justice on the case of the genocide accusations put forward on over Gaza. John Dugard, a well-respected international law scholar, pointed out, looking at the American president's speeches, and this precedes Trump too, that the language of liberal international order, more specifically reference to international law, has been replaced in the United States by reference to rules-based order, without ever really defining what rules-based order is or the rules are. And this is quite significant. If it's my role and I get to choose my role and determine what is just and what is unjust, that's not really a rule. And of course, international law has had much more complex history and, of course, tortured past as well. But it has also been more widely accepted and, of course, much better defined. And if we are jettisoning the language of international law to something that is so much more self-righteous in terms of rules-based order, which is very ambiguous, we are in deep trouble. And of course, this is also why we see now that the United States assertion worldwide is not really based on any liberal language, but just MAGA, plain and simple. This is not what John Dugard wrote. He published his piece before the return of Trump to power. So this is my sort of addition here, but here you go. So my point is that Japan's new security policy is better seen as an irrational product of US-dependent domestic power play. And here, I don't mean to say that all politics is domestic, because of course there is ample evidence that the Japanese politicians to fight the domestic power struggle resort to the use of international pressure, very well-known foreign pressure, gaiatsu. And at the same time, of course, the US pressure is evident too, and it has a role to play as well. So this is not just a simple question of second image or, second image reversed, but it's both ways. But I think we do lose sight of the complexity of the changes that are afoot and end up being overly self-righteous and optimistic about their own capabilities to exert rational change if we don't put in consideration of the fact that messy politics is a fact here in Japan as well as in the United States and elsewhere. And it's not just a Chinese issue. This is an interesting juxtaposition of images from the past, and this dates back more or less to, of course, the period before the re-election of Donald Trump. But Steve Bannon, the former chief strategist of Donald Trump, famously quipped that Abe was Trump before Trump, and he meant it as a compliment. And indeed, Trump was the one who campaigned in December 2012 on the slogan, Taking Back Japan, well before Making America Great Again was used in the Trump campaign. And when he said, Bannon said Trump before Trump, he meant to say, that as the headlines in the this Japan Times article image captures, he meant it in terms of playing hardball with China. Being tough on China. Hillary Clinton, at the same time, who was, of course, the rival candidate to Trump back in the first election of Trump, when Abe passed away, tragically murdered by Yamagami in relation to the Unification Church scandal. She opined Prime Minister Abe was a champion of democracy and a firm believer that no economy, society, or country can achieve its full potential if women are left behind. And so he was a champion of democracy and a champion of women. And somehow this kind of adulation of Mr. Abe, I think, of course, prepared the ground for the more recent Prime Minister Takaichi to try to satisfy both sides in her current um, um, position as Prime Minister and as Abe's successor. So, but there is a real perception gap from the West or from the United States and how Abe has been understood uh, more in a much more divisive, controversial way in domestic politics. As far as the United States is concerned, and of course Japan's alliance managers too, Abe was the best thing that ever happened. He delivered everything that they could have hoped for and more. And he also changed the Japanese domestic political system with lasting impact, perhaps even enabling Takaichi to continue on. And he certainly laid the ground for further changes to take place under his successors, Suga and Kishida, and more recently Ishiba as well. So there's been an ever-deepening integration of Japan's security and economy with the US and against China in a way that we haven't seen before, Abe, quite in the same way. Even though there are, of course, precursors to Abe as well, and I'll probably mention that later as well in my discussion with Linus. And this is also why Kishida insisted on holding a state funeral when Abe passed away. He did mention that Abe was the Prime Minister of Japan who's been most respected by the international community. And a lot of us in Japan, not everybody, of course, but a lot of us in Japan kind of cringed at the idea, but at the same time, it's true. Many of my liberal friends in the West have been very positive about Abe, knowing or unknowing of the domestic problems that he created with, again, very lasting legacies. Um, Domestically, he actually had consistently underwhelming support. Uh, this is often not known even by the Japanese, but Abe not even once scored more votes than Aso did when Aso lost to the DPJ and lost power for the first time, against a major opposition party for the LDP. Abe scored less than Aso every single time and yet kept on winning the election, but he was never very popular. And there was, of course, also 3 losses in a row in Okinawa governor election and 1 loss in referendum in place where it really matters a lot for the bilateral relations as well. And there's been a range of stories of democratic backsliding, breach of constitutionalism, cronyism scandals, and triumph of historical revisionism domestically. And again, on this topic, this is closer to my own sort of home base in terms of specialization, so I can go on for hours, but I'm not going to do that for today. This is a kind of a graph that I hoped might be somewhat useful in understanding what is taking place. And I would like to take a look at the right-hand side first. The right-hand side indicates the lower house vote share, and this is to do with the single-member district vote. The Japanese voters have 2 votes in the lower house election as well, one for the proportional representation regional blocks, and the other one for the single-member district, like in the UK. And it's with the single-member district vote that I'm quoting here. The yellow part is the abstention. So you can see it's the biggest part. 2009 is when Aso's LDP lost against Hatoyama's DPJ and fell from power. So this was DPJ victory. Unusually, in recent years, the DPJ actually got more votes than the abstention bloc did. Since then, you can see the LDP came back to power, but you can see also with fewer votes. So 2012, December 2012 is when Abe came back to power, brought the LDP back to power after 3 years and 3 month hiatus. But actually with fewer votes, you can see the difference in the red block. the abstention grew. And the biggest reason why the DPJ fell from power was, of course, it split and it was reduced to a much smaller share of the votes. And something that didn't quite exist until the DPJ collapsed in orange, what I wrote non-LDP right, meaning splinter groups from the DPJ, but also Ishin. And also back at the time, there was your party as well. And today I would include the DPP, Tamaki's DPP2 in this category, but the non-LDP and non-DPJ or CDP center-right parties were created after. Some of them are more centrist than others. And today I included Sunseto as well in this particular box. So in terms of the seats, you can see on the left-hand side that there's also been dramatic change. The single-member district system exaggerates, of course, the share of the seats of the winner. And you can see that the DPJ gained from that advantage and the LDP gained even bigger. And so when Abe came back to power in December 2012, with this red block of votes, he got this many seats. And Komeito is actually not included in here. Komeito is included in other. And so together with Komeito, they got more than 2/3 of the seats in the lower house consistently. And he went on to win 2 more lower house elections in a row. But the vote distribution and the seat distribution largely remained the same. Things started to change more recently with the 2024 election last year that Ishiba lost. You can see that, in fact, the LDP share of the votes continued to decline. And in fact, oddly, the non-LDP rights vote also continued to decline. And if anything, the CDP gained in the votes. The other remained more or less stationary. But the results after the vagary of the single-member district system in a multi-party contest, as you know very well in the UK as well, what happened was that the LDP did lose substantially the number of seats, and in fact went over the majority, went below the majority of the seats. But the non-LDP right became sufficiently big of a bloc, while the CDP regained some seats. It was still far from being able to get a majority on its own. So what happened was, over the longer term, was more the issue of the DPJ CDP falling apart and creating this non-LDP right bloc, which has now the dynamics of generally siding with the LDP. And the CDP is chasing after it. And so there is a rightward shift dynamics in the party system as a whole. Moving on to something that is perhaps seemingly more lighthearted, truthiness is a word that was recently added, well, by now, 20 years ago, by Stephen Colbert. Some of you may know a satirist, a comic in the United States, popular, but of course also being taken out of the airwaves under pressure coming from Trump, it seems. And according to Merriam-Webster, it's the idea that a truthful or seemingly truthful quality that is claimed for something, not because of supporting facts or evidence, but because of a feeling that it is true or a desire for it to be true. Learning from Colbert, I would propose the term strengthiness with the same kind of fake lack of substance of strength, but the feeling that something is strong. And this is a hapless Sagawa, the beast of finance bureaucrat who had to lie in front of the Diet many times in order to protect Prime Minister Abe at the time, where he famously received a memo from the Prime Minister, Motto tsuyoki de ike, be more assertive, be more bullish when you lie, basically. So with Takaichi, I think we reached to another level of strengthiness. Last year, when Ishiba won, actually Takaichi was unacceptable for the US-Japan alliance managers. I was at Harvard at the time, I talked to some people, it was very clear that Takaichi was not a possibility while Biden was still in power. She just doesn't play well with the American agenda of the state policy of containing China under the name of democracy versus autocracy. So Ishiba won with the support, surprisingly, of Suga and Kishida. But once they were marginalized because of the Unification Church scandal, also because of the slush fund scandal, Japan's LDP's right wing, including Takaichi, renewed their Strengthiness propaganda warfare to reclaim lost ground. And they said that Sanseto and other right-wing parties are the LDP's lost children, and we need to reclaim them. And that's the only reason why we lost power. Uh, Takaichi thus won, but she lost coalition partner Komeito immediately. And there's been a confidence and supply agreement with Ishin. This has been misrepresented in Japan repeatedly as coalition, Lenditsu. But in political science term, nobody calls it a coalition agreement. This is confidence and supply. They do not supply, Ishin doesn't supply members of the executive, members of the cabinet. And so at this point anyway, so it's still a confidence and supply agreement only. And on top of that, even with Ishin, they are still short of a majority in both houses. So actually Takaichi's position is still very, very weak within the Diet. But because of this image of strengthiness, there's been a remaking of LDP Rule Assistance Association, Yoksan Taisei, by the media also, that you feel like Takaichi is invincible. But you look at Team Takaichi, it's actually really Team Taiwan. I was quite surprised when I saw that. So Aso Takaichi, of course, both darlings in Taiwan and prominent members of the Taiwan lobby now that Abe has passed away. On top of that, Furuya, who's the chairman of the Taiwan lobby, is the election chief of the LDP. Hagiuda, of course, famous for the Unification Church scandal, as well as the slush fund scandal, is now reinstated as the deputy chairman of the LDP. He is also the chairman of the Taiwan lobby. Kihara, who became the chief cabinet secretary, is the secretary general of the Taiwan lobby. Arimura, the deputy chairman of the LDP, is also a member of the Taiwan lobby. Ozaki, who's right here on to the left on the photo, to the right on the photograph of Takaichi, both paying respect to Abe's statue in Kaohsiung in Taiwan. He's the deputy chief cabinet secretary. And out, of course, is Moriyama, who was the chairman of the LDP under Ishiba. And Hayashi, too, of course, is now given a purely domestic post in the cabinet, and Komeito is out as well. So from the Chinese perspective, it is really Team Taiwan, and it is as we never seen before. In fact, even Abe had Nikai, who was the head of the China lobby, as chairman of the LDP between 2017 and 2022. And therefore, in terms of communication channel with the Chinese leadership, it's really a cold shoulder that Takaichi gave, and it is quite provocative as a move. And at this point, Biden's integrated deterrence has been recasted as MAGA subservient new golden age. And I wrote in very strong terms, US extortion racket. But that's what it looks like from after Trump's visit to Japan. And here, if you are a fan of Godfather, particularly part two, like I am, this is Don Fanucci, who circulated around Little Italy in Manhattan to collect so-called protection money. And that's who I was reminded of after Trump left Japan. But the question is for Japan, how far can the naked army march on? Takaichi government doesn't have a parliamentary majority, has no democratic legitimacy, public finance, her spending plans are not backed by concrete idea of how to finance them. And of course, the industrial power of Japan is persistently on the decline. And how are you going to continue to do this? Naked Army, of course, is a reference to Harakazo's documentary film, The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, Yukiyukite Shingun. But it resembles to me a lot like the Japanese empire that people like Takaichi much admire. There's no logistic support. There's overextension of policy commitments, and the front line are being expanded without any material support to back it up in so many different ways. And in the meantime, there's a risk of provocation, entanglement, and abandonment by the United States. And This is several images from the recent visit. Uh, I wrote Ageto Kiai. This is a set of words from the psychiatrist Saito Tamaki, who wrote about the Yankee culture, subculture in Japan, in terms of these sort of kind of spirits. And To the left, of course, are the images of the leaders meeting. And Skajan is Yokosuka jumper, famous for Yankee wear that originated from the U.S. naval base city of Yokosuka, where Koizumi Jr. is from. But also to the right, some of you may be able to see Dainihon Aikokuto, if you have been in Japan from many, many years ago, some of you may know Akao Bin, who was a very known fixture of right-wing politics back in those days. He was in the 1970s, and he was the founder, owner of Dainippon Aikokuto, and his niece was involved in Sanseito launching. She was even a candidate in the upper house election this year. She lost, and I think she's since quit Sanseito. But what is funny here is that you see Kokutai Goji, the upholding of the emperor system, and while welcoming the United States. This is how twisted things are in the revisionist camp. There is this real irony, but it doesn't really seem like upholding the liberal order, but more like Yankee rule, and Yankee in both sense, in the sense of American rule, but also the kind of Yankee culture, subculture in Japan in many ways, which prides on having high spirit without really much substance in terms of material and concrete foundation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Koichi, for a really rich and thought-provoking lecture. And I'd also like to thank the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation for organizing this webinar and for inviting me to comment briefly on the Koichi's talk. So in my comments, I'd like to address three overarching themes. And as part of each, I'll also pose a few questions for you, Koichi, which will hopefully help you expand a bit on your thoughts and open up the discussion. So first of all, I'd like to discuss where our concerns overlap, and then I would like to discuss how we can make sense of Japan's security policy, Japan's changing security policy. And the third theme is how to enhance Japan's security. So first of all, where our concerns overlap. So like you, and I suppose many of you in the audience, I've closely been following Japan's security policy changes over the years, trying to make sense of them and trying to explain them. And like you, I've also been concerned by the fact that the China threat thesis, as well as the North Korea threat thesis, actually seem a bit disproportionate to the level of threat. Now, the Japanese government, of course, has continued to say things that make quite a lot of sense from within the dominant threat discourse, such as Japan needs to enhance its deterrent capability to safeguard its peace from the potential belligerence of China, North Korea, and most recently Russia, or to protect democratic Japan from these authoritarian states, it's necessary to introduce certain exceptions to democratic governance, particularly less transparency regarding security and defense matters, including enhanced secrecy legislation and similar. However, people like us find the instrumentalization of these perceived threats, along with what we might call Japan's remilitarization, increasingly troubling, right? And the reason is that it's becoming clear that Japan isn't remilitarizing merely to strengthen its contributions to a liberal world order. That is, if such an order can even be said to exist unproblematically, let alone remain intact today. And these are some of the things that you touched on in your talk also. Rather, while figures such as Abe Shinzo and Takaichi Sanae often seem to say the right thing, so to speak, in public, then getting praise from liberal politicians such as Hillary Clinton, as you brought up in your talk, Koichi, they actually represent an ideological undercurrent that feels quite distant from liberalism. When I was introduced, you heard that I was a visiting professor at Waseda University earlier this year. And at that time, I had the pleasure of exchanging ideas on several occasions with the likes of Abe and Takaichi. And on one occasion, I joined a roundtable with some of Takaichi's political allies, who described her not only as Abe's heir, but also, perhaps more importantly, as someone who might advance the conservative agenda in a more consistent fashion than Abe did. From those discussions that I had, I gathered that this agenda includes not only an inflated China threat narrative and enthusiasm about remilitarization, but also elements of history revisionism, reverence for an ideal Japanese emperor, cultural particularism, racism, misogyny, and also, interestingly, some hope that the US Trump administration might abandon Japan, thereby opening the door to an indigenous nuclear weapons capability. So for all the talk of making proactive contributions to peace, something else seems to be lurking in the background. Moreover, despite the continued emphasis on freedom and democracy, such as in the free and open Indo-Pacific, Japan's actual democratic indicators have also declined, and this is also something you touched on, of course, Koichi. So, for example, in Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index, Japan fell from 11th place in 2010 to between 66th and 72nd place from 2016 to through last year. The varieties of democracy data from University of Gothenburg similarly register democratic regression in Japan over the same period. So it seems in Japanese narratives, the term democracy often functions less as a description of empirically verifiable governance and more as an identity signifier, something that ostensibly distinguishes Japan from China, from North Korea, and from Russia. Needless to say, peace serves a similar function. And of course, this is not unique to Japan. I think we see similar dynamics in many other countries in the world, including, unfortunately, my own Sweden. So let me pause here and ask my first question to you, Koichi. Japanese progressives, such as yourself, have expressed concern about the direction of Japan's security policy for more than 70 years. Each small departure from Article 9 of the Constitution has been portrayed as existential evidence that Japan is starting to resemble its pre-war and wartime incarnations. Now, to what extent and why might those who worried about Japanese remilitarization, say in the 1960s or 1970s, have been misguided? And what might those who see today's developments as simply part of a long-term continuity, what might they be underestimating? In other words, what in your view makes the current moment distinct or special? So I would like to let Koichi in here, and then I will continue with my remarks after his reply.
Thank you, Linus. And I tried to be brief so that you can continue with your comments, which are very insightful. In terms of, I think, I mean, of course, I'm 55, so I haven't been involved in the peace movement for 70 years myself. But I have to say that they were rather more successful back in the 1970s and up until relatively recently in terms of resisting the US pressure, but also the pressure from the Japanese conservatives to try to remilitarize Japan. I think the really fundamental change that came into place is about 10 years ago with the lifting of the ban on collective self-defense in cabinet decision in 2014, followed by the security legislation in 2015. And that was so significant in that Article 9 doesn't really retain any meaningful sense anymore. that if Article 9 doesn't even ban the exercise of collective self-defense as opposed to individual self-defense, then it doesn't really mean much of anything at all. If Japan is more and more capable of getting involved in another country without being attacked in the first place, then what does Article 9 means? And so what that means is, of course, that the government is now having the upper hand and perhaps even exclusive say over what is a national crisis that allows Japan to defend itself, quote and unquote. In other words, what was stopped in the Diet and by the Constitution in the earlier post-war decades are now in the hands of the government, which is not even a majority government at this time. And in fact, for example, the so-called security documents, Ampo Sanbunsho, which were adopted recently, which Takaichi wants to revise further, we don't even know who drafted them, even at this point. So we have no transparency whatsoever. And the decision making that is done is not only undemocratic and unconstitutional, we have no power to stop it anymore. So that's a very significant qualitative change that has taken place.
Thank you. So from your presentation, Koichi, I get the impression that you have two primary frameworks for explaining Japan's security policy. I think one is the Japan-US alliance. And in this, it seems that you are following a long line of progressive thinkers, both in Japan and abroad, who have lamented Japan's dependence on and subservient role within the alliance, often linking this to broader patterns of US imperialism, right? I think the second tendency here is to talk about domestic politics, and I think here maybe you align yourself more with the perspective of diplomatic history, which is quite prominent within Japan. But anyway, I'll focus here especially on your emphasis on the Japan-US alliance. You stated quite clearly that you see Japan's security policy as an irrational product of a US-dependent domestic power play. This is, I think, a direct quote from your PowerPoint. While I find this explanation quite compelling, I'm currently developing a complementary and perhaps, to some extent, competing perspective in a book that I'm writing. And it builds on a decade and a half of research on identity, narrative, and emotion. In this book manuscript, I interpret US pressure as a form of symbolic pressure. It's a set of expectations that define how Japan must behave in order to gain the recognition that many Japanese seem to believe the country deserves, right? This, I think, helps explain Japan's frequent use of narratives built around ideas of expectation. This is, I think, one term that is often heard. Another term, which is very common, is responsibility. Japan needs to take responsibility, or Japan needs to make a contribution that is commensurate to its standing or to its role. And of course, more recently, and ironically, at the same time as Japan's actual democracy has deteriorated, the terms democracy and rules-based order, the free and open Indo-Pacific, these terms have also increased. And I think these are all part of same kind of symbolic pressure. So, but then now, the more fundamental factor is perhaps that Japan's sensitivity to this kind of pressure. Why is Japan sensitive to this kind of symbolic pressure? Well, in my interactions with Japanese conservatives, I often sense a lingering desire for Japan to be acknowledged as a great power. And that desire seems to be rooted in a kind of fantasy of Japan's uniqueness and superiority. Not only uniqueness and superiority vis-a-vis its Asian neighbors, but I think that is really important, but also uniqueness and to some extent superiority, among like-minded countries in the world, other great powers. Now, to me, this perhaps helps explain why Japanese conservatives not only view China and North Korea as physical threats, but also why there is such preoccupation with seeing China and actually South Korea as inferior, as ungrateful, as immoral, as somehow being substandard and below Japan, right? So keeping that kind of hierarchy seems really important. Of course, there's a lot of tension here, and I think you touched on that towards the end of your talk. Talked about the tension between being subordinate partner in the alliance, and having these kind of desire and these kind of fantasies. So Japan is craving recognition as a great power, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of frustration within Japan that such recognition is never quite sufficient. There also seems to be a tension between an identification rooted in uniqueness and superiority, but also a symbolic order that prescribes Japan to be normal, right? And I think the term normal here is really interesting. It's been floating around Japan's security policy discourse, I think, since the mid 1990s when it was introduced there. So put it differently, I think there's a persistent friction between aspirations for independent great power status and Japan's position as the junior partner in an alliance with the United States. And I have a few questions related to these tensions. So first of all, Koichi, do you agree that Japan's security policy changes can be seen as driven not only by external pressures or their domestic instrumentalization, which you also touched on, but also by these kind of internal impulses, particularly a more unconscious, perhaps, desire to reclaim great power status? And I also wonder, how do you see these tensions being navigated in practice? In other words, to what extent and in what ways has Japan's dependence on the United States changed over time, in your opinion?
Thank you, Linus. I would largely agree with what you say, although I'm not quite certain whether I will call this necessarily a desire for great power status. And maybe it's a point that I have yet to think more fully, but at least as far as I know, in my own interaction with government officials in Japan, or alliance managers in general, to me, I think they are really coming across as very eager to be subservient to the United States. They like the idea that they get a pat on their shoulder and being flattered by this idea that we are equal partners. But they must know that the Americans don't mean it. But they want to be liked. They want to be respected in Washington. Is that great power status? Is that subservience? To me, it seems to be more like accepting subservient status, but wanting to be the manager of Japan. And they represent Japan. They can deliver Japan for the US counterparts. And they really, and so many of them are not accountable to the Japanese people anymore. The electoral system, the party system is entirely broken. The media is also not doing its job anymore. And therefore, they are not held accountable, but they are really much more eager to get support from the United States. The reverse part with China, I agree with you. I think it's really a form of racist sense of superiority. The modern Japan that they adore, of course, is a history of Japan having successfully westernized and have received an honorary white status in the imperialist race. And that's what they really like. And so the idea that China or North Korea, but also South Korea, as you correctly pointed out, is now emerging as a threat, as a rival to Japan in terms of westernization, modernization, and the level of civilization as they see it, is an affront, is an unacceptable thing, and it cannot be allowed. And I think, so in that respect, the fact that Trump seem to have made a slip of a tongue in terms of honestly talking about G2 is about the worst thing that could happen to the Japanese US alliance managers. I think that's what they want to prevent. That's that they want to sort of cling to the United States so that Japan will still retain the status of a partner in Asia of the United States, and the US and China will not talk above its head and shake their hands above its head.
Thank you, Koichi. Before moving over to my third theme here, I would just like to say that I agree that it's more common to see Japanese superiority or a sense of superiority being expressed in relation to Asian neighbors. But I think especially Abe often emphasized Japan having to play an equal role to the United States. He really emphasized equality. And you remember when he gave that talk in the United States, and after someone had said that will Japan be tier 2 country, and he said, no, make no mistake, we're never going to be a tier 2 country. And then from then on, he kept talking about equality. So I think this is part of my, my evidence, so to speak here. But over to my third question, how to enhance Japan's security. Of course, I agree with you that Japan's security policies seem to be deserving criticism, and not only Japan's security policy, but I think security policy in general deserves a lot of criticism or critical scrutiny. But still, we may need security policy, unfortunately. So I would like to push you a little on how you think Japan should conduct its security policy, given your criticism. And of course, I agree with you that the proponents of deterrence often seem to underestimate the risks of provocation, which you mentioned, and also the dynamics of a security dilemma, which you didn't mention, but I think it's kind of implicit in your talk. At the same time, they also tend to overestimate how reliable alliance arrangements really are. And here you mentioned toward the end of your talk the risks of abandonment and entrapment. And of course, these are real risks that every country that has an alliance, they need to kind of reckon with these risks. So it seems in both cases, people who are like security experts, they seem to overlook the fact that security policy is fundamentally relational, and it's also therefore inherently insecure, right? This is the irony of security policy. Security policy is not secure, but it is insecure. So the point first is that everything we do becomes part of the broader security dynamic. What Japan does also becomes part of that. And this relational or systemic quality, of course, combined with the impossibility of precisely reconstructing causal relations and accurately gauging the intentions of others, this makes, I think, security policy really complex and really difficult. Still, even if we don't agree with Japan's current security trajectory, I think it seems reasonable that we should still try to think about what alternatives might look like, despite all these caveats. So I think this leads me to my final question. What kind of policy do you think would make Japan more secure? And I think, there are probably a range of different, I suppose there might be a range of different options here. Is there still a role for deterrence more precisely, perhaps in combination with policies of reassurance? Or how do you see the role of deterrence? Is all deterrence bad, so to speak? And more broadly, how do you think Japan can contribute in creating a more secure and peaceful regional environment, both for itself and for others? So that's my last question. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Linus. That's a great question and a very important one. And like you, I reject the false dichotomy between realism and idealism. The idea that realism is realistic, whereas idealism is just idealistic, is just not true. I think the fact that the so-called realists, who are very big fans and promoters of deterrent theory, doesn't really talk about at all, in the Japanese case, about the risks involved, is hypocrisy. And they are not being realistic at all. The fact that, America fought a series of wars in Asia during Cold War and not won a single one of them, and the fact that these societies have been devastated, we need to think about it. What does it mean for America to come to rescue Taiwan or Japan if it did, which is a big question? And putting all the Japanese eggs into one US basket, to me, is not realistic at all. And idealism, of course, is not really viable unless it's grounded on certain degree of realistic assessment. So I'm not in favor of immediate end to all the deterrence capabilities that we have. I think we need to de-escalate. We need to change. But and escalation is not the way to go. Japan can simply not sustain the remilitarization agenda it's being proposed. If it does, then society will look entirely different. The same goes to Taiwan as well. I love Taiwan, and who doesn't among the Japanese people, really, for various reasons, including wrong ones too. But in any case, Taiwan will be changed forever if it's going to arm itself to the extent to which it needs. If it was going to depend on deterrence might capabilities, given the U.S. non-commitment that we continue to see, which is the reality that any idealist should understand. And therefore, in order to preserve what is good of what we have and to try to eliminate what we don't like and which is threatening to us. I think we need to work together. And I think, putting all the eggs into one basket is just the wrong way to go. I actually did some research, I mean, very easy one, using Asahi database, for example. You can just search for the term Nichibei Kanke and Nichibei Dome, right? We talk about US-Japan security alliance as if US and Japan is just an alliance relationship. For many, many years in the post-war period, the preferred terminology, in fact, by far the most common terminology was US-Japan relations. And it was understood to be the most important one. But there was even a dispute over whether you can call it an alliance, given that it wasn't an equal alliance of any kind at all. And Japan, of course, there was a constitutional taboo over the question whether a military alliance is even constitutional. And therefore, even the LDP government was very reluctant to use, and there was no consensus in the LDP whatsoever about the idea that US and Japan has an alliance. And therefore, it's only in the 2000s that the term alliance completely replaces the term kanke, relations, which means that economy and the military have become so intertwined. In fact, the economy has become subservient to the military drive, that the US-Japan relations is now only seen as an alliance relationship. This is unhealthy. And when Trump is weaponizing the economy, the tariffs, and going against all the preaching that we received over the decades from the West, from the United States, about unfair trade practices, about the chip wars and trade wars and all that sort of thing, this is racist. They just cannot accept the idea that we live in a much more multipolar world. And the idea that white supremacist order is now falling apart is something that is not acceptable to people who currently hold power in the United States. And we need to acknowledge that. And this is not about the liberal order. This is about coexisting through peaceful means as much as possible, and by trying to push back potential military conflict as much as we can. And that seems to be a much saner way to try to push reality closer to an ideal situation, rather than pretending that we are still so powerful, that the US is still so powerful. And in East Asia, we are talking about, of course, nuclear powers sandwiching Japan and Taiwan, and Russia, China, and the United States, North Korea too. These are all nuclear powers. And it doesn't seem to be that increasing deterrence is really a way to safety in any meaningful way. So I stopped that. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both very much, Professors Koichi Nakano and Linus Hagström. And thank you all for taking part today. And I apologize we didn't get around to all of your questions, but we have now run out of time. So please join us again next time.